Good afternoon.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful to see all of you here today. I'm Vicki Sullivan, professor of political science at Tufts University, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests here. The Department of Political Science is a co-sponsor of this event, and I'd like to thank our wonderful students and Abdul Salom for helping us out on this. It is also co-sponsored by the International Machiavelli Society. And that was founded by Sean Irwin of Berry College, Gabriella Pedula of Roma Tre, Mario De Caro of Tufts and Roma Tre, Ioannis, Evrigenis, as you know, former professor at Tufts University, now of Claremont College, and I. And our intention in founding the society is to have scholars who write in different languages being able to communicate with each other, exchange ideas, and it is the case in great figures of literature and the philosophical tradition that scholars in a particular language get siloed. And so we are really happy to have started this conversation, an international conversation about Machiavelli. The first international meeting was in Rome in December of 2023. We will be meeting again in December of 25 in Paris. And so we're really happy to have this little event to sort of keep the momentum going. So thank you very much for being here. Our first presenter will be Mario De Caro, and he's a philosophy professor here in Roma Tre. As I said, he has a great diversity of philosophical interests, and he is the author and editor of numerous monographs in both Italian and English. He is the associate editor of the Journal of the American Philosophical Association and the Ancient Philosophy Today Journal. He's a member of the editorial and scientific boards of several international journals. He is the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Liberal Nationalism that was published in 2022. And today you can see what his title is, Machiavelli's Exemplarism and the Tradition of the Specula Principia. And then our next presenter after that is Professor James Hankins of Harvard University. He is a professor, extremely renowned professor of intellectual history of the Renaissance. He is the general editor of the Itati Everyday Renaissance Library. It's the famous blue books. They're wonderful, and they match the green books and the red books of Loeb, which we all know. In 2012, he was honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Renaissance Society of America. He's published numerous books, so I'm just going to mention two, the most recent. One is Virtue Politics, Soulcraft and Statecraft in Renaissance Italy, and more recently, Political Meritocracy in Renaissance Italy. He is going to be presenting today on Machiavelli, Francesco Patrizi of Siena, and the origins of political modernity. After Professor Hankins, we have Professor Catherine Zuckert, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Notre Dame. She has written a lot of books, a lot of very big, important books on diverse topics. It's really quite remarkable. She has written on American literature, postmodernists on Plato, Plato's dialogues, Leo Strauss, and most importantly for today, a very big book on Machiavelli, entitled Machiavelli's Politics, which was published in 2017. Today, Professor Zuckert will be speaking on Machiavelli's Belfagor, Good Government, Domestic Tyranny, and Freedom. And last but not least, Ioannis Evrigenis, our own, born and bred here, shall we say, formerly of Tufts University. He is now proudly the Alice Tweed Toohey Professor of Government and Ethics at Claremont McKenna College. He is the author of a book on the fear of enemies and another on Hobbes's State of Nature. He is the co-editor of a special issue of the History of European Ideas journal devoted to Machiavelli and his influence. He is the editor of the digital version of Jean Baudin's 6 books of the Commonwealth, and he's going to be speaking today on Machiavellian psychology. So please, a warm Tufts, Boston welcome for our guest.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I'm very happy to be here with some friends, colleagues, and former colleagues and young scholars. So I will defend 2 claims in my talk. One is not particularly bold. So that Machiavelli destroyed the paradigm of the specula principum from within. And the second is a little bolder. In his opposition to all previous views, including the humanistic version of virtue politics, and I'm referring here to the instant classic book by Professor Hankins, Machiavelli outlines a radically new kind of virtue politics that I think has resonances even today. So let me start with the premise on virtue ethics in general, because the point will be how virtue ethics is applied to the field of politics. There are some theoretical pillars that all the authors who defend virtue ethics accept. The first is a particularist ethics. It means that it doesn't accept the idea that there are general principles that valid in all situations, like what the ontological ethics, like think about Kant's ethics, the categorical imperative, or the 10 Commandments. That would be a kind of universalist ethics on the ontological side, or all the versions of consequentialism, like utilitarianism, have universal principles. No, that's not the case for virtue ethics. Virtue ethics thinks that each particular situation and each particular agent have to be addressed in specifically. There are no universal principles that can help us in understanding what's just to do this in each situation. Second, virtue ethics is centered on the notion of character, neither on the intention principles on which actions are performed, like for the ontological ethics, nor on the consequences, like what consequentialists or utilitarian would do. The central notion is character, the character of the agent. And the third idea is exemplarism. So you learn from specific cases, and especially you learn from the example of virtuous people, or even vicious people, what you shouldn't do. You learn from examples, okay? That's the idea. These are accepted by every virtue ethicist, but there are some, I don't know what happened here. Yeah, some contentious issues. So the first one is, in a virtue ethics, you should accept the idea that all virtues are connected. So if you have one virtue, you tend to have the others, or they are disconnected. So that's generally you have few of them or one, but not all of them. So this is one issue. Second issue is ethical virtues are certainly habits, the way we behave, the way we have been trained to behave. But these habits are also skills. Skills in the same sense in which, playing tennis is a skill or speaking languages is a skill. Are they skills? That's a very hot issue nowadays. Third, there are in the history of philosophy, two main views about how to judge moral behavior, and especially what is virtuous and what is not. The typical dyadic view that was typical in Plato, but also in Christian thought, is this idea there are vices, and there are virtues, and they're opposed. And then there is the triadic view, typical of the Aristotelian tradition, in which there are two opposite possibilities of behaving generally, and you have to be in the middle if you want to be virtuous. So you can, if you are a soldier, you could be, without any rationality, you attack furiously, that's wrong, or you are fearful, that's wrong, you have to be in the middle, okay? That's the idea. So two different ways of interpreting moral behavior. And the last issue is this. That's a little more technical, very alive today. So should we conceive of virtue ethics in a way in which there is a plurality of virtues, ontologicalism, from the point of view of reality? There is a plurality of virtues, altruism, generosity, courage, and so on. And there is a meta-virtue that is practical wisdom, phronesis, that orchestrate all these virtues. So there is this, individual virtues and a meta-virtue, or, and this is the Aristotelian view, or there is the Socratic view, so the Plato, Socrates, of course, according to which what really matters is practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is what really matters, and the individual virtues are just expression of this only virtue, the real one, okay? This is another contentious issue. All this will be relevant at the end of my talk. So I hope you have memorized all. So let's briefly say something about the specula. These are manuals, proto-encyclopedias that were popular in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and they gave instructions and summarized the knowledge of the period in some specific fields. Some examples. Attributed to Roger Bacon, a Speculum Alchemiae, to Albertus Magnus, a Speculum Astronomiae, and this is Conrad over here, so the Speculum Virginum, how you should behave with young ladies. That was the manual about. These are famous examples of these books. Look, the metaphor of the mirror has a normative character, because the mirror, and that comes from Paul, 2 letters to the Corinthians, especially the second one. So the mirror doesn't lie. It tells the truth about you. And in this sense, in this telling you the truth, reflects Christ's image. So gives you the idea of what you should do, because it reflects Christ. So the idea the mirror is a normative, books that tell you in a normative way, really the way you should behave. And then there is a particular subfield, the specula principum, and this is a subgenre, that instructed rulers on how you should govern successfully. So this is inspired by Xenophon and Seneca, and there are some famous cases, including Petrarch and Boccaccio. So, there are three main phases in the history of specula principum. The first one is in the High Middle Ages. And here was how to reconcile the political functions of rulers with the Christian moral values. So, in particularly the cardinal virtues and the other virtues like pietas, misericordia, clementia, and even cruelty, with that you have to enact sometimes against enemies of the faith, okay? And here are a couple of examples. Then, during the late Middle Ages, the specula were more used in addressing the issue how power was justified, what was legitimate between the emperor and the papacy, right? And so they were using that direction to justify the fact that, either the emperor or the pope was in charge, should be in charge. And then there is the last one, humanism, and this is when the specula go back to the original attempt to see what is the relationship between ethics and politics, what is the character of the virtuous ruler and the traditional moral virtues, what is their role in politics. This is, of course, involves virtue ethics that I mentioned before. Pontano and Erasmus wrote 2 famous treatises. Now, what are the features of the specula principum? First, there is an educational paranetic function, delectare and docere. So they had to be entertaining, but they also had to teach something. It wasn't pure fun. You had to learn from reading them. And Then there is this tradition, exemplarism. So they proceeded by giving examples, exempla, of how you should behave, giving, virtuous stories of virtuous people. And as Seneca said, longum iter est per precepta, brevet efficax per exempla. So if you have to theorize about things, it's very long. If you give examples, people will understand much faster. That seems a fair way of putting it. And then the third feature is that when in argumenting, they use the language of virtue theory. Okay, the virtue theory, the kind of moral thought conception that I sketched at the beginning. So these are the three features. Memorize also these three features. And now, my point is that from a formal point of view, the prince fits perfectly the description of a speculum. This is, for example, I said that the first feature is that speculum has an educational parenthetic function. And here are three quotations from Machiavelli, from the Prince. The first is, look at what he says. My intent is to write something useful to whoever understands it. It has appeared to be more fitting to go directly to the effectual truth of the thing than to the imagination of it. Okay, so he wants to teach something from his own experience and from the experiences of people in the past. One may draw a general rule that never, that's a kind of a formula I use sometimes, one may draw a general rule that never really fails. These are rules of the time. They are not universal principles. In some specific situations, you should remember that Alexander the Great or Septimius Severus behaved that way. That's the way, the kind of rules he gives us. And another one is a mood that never fails. So he gives the instructions, in this specific case, to a prince, okay, to a ruler. So it fits the first criterion to be a speculum, the educational parenthetic function. The second one is exemplarism. So Machiavelli knew very well the exemplarist literature, especially Livy and Plutarch, and it defends explicitly the idea that you have to argue from examples, using examples. For example, he says, as to the exercise of the mind, a prince should read histories and considering them the actions of excellent men, should see how they conducted themselves in wars, should examine the causes of their victories and losses so as to be able to avoid the latter and imitate the former. So it's methodologically very clear. You should learn from examples, and what he does, right? He gives examples continuously. Actually, in the Prince he discusses 47 historical or semi or pseudo-historical figures, and each represent one virtue or more than one or a vice, and you should be inspired by learning about these figures. Famous examples in the Prince, Gorgias, Septimius Severus, Agathocles, a little controversial, and in another book of his, Castruccio Castracani, that no one knew who he was until he made it famous. Again, another thing about exemplarism. In Machiavelli, that's kind of well-known, but just let me summarize. Machiavelli has a twofold justification of how we can learn from studying historical examples, how a ruler can learn from that. And so the first justification is a meta-historical thesis. History repeats itself, particularly the history of political institutions. Okay, according to Polybian Anacyclosis, all human events, whether present or to come, have their exact counterpart in the past. So you learn because history repeats itself. So you have to learn to know what happened in the past, because it's what is going to happen again. And the second is an anthropological thesis. Human nature is immutable. Men, whose passions and dispositions remaining in all ages the same, naturally give rise to the same effects. And these are both from the discourses, but they are, of course, also in the spirit of the Prince. Men are born and live and die, always in accordance with the same rules. So, because history itself, we are all the same, you have to learn from the past. Okay? Now, so the first, as I saw, there are already, it has a deductive educational function. the prince, so as the other specula, is based on exemplarism. And now the third idea is appeal to the language of virtue theory. So in the prince, Machiavelli very often mentions the traditional cardinal virtues, either in their own standard form or in their derivation. So for example, justice, the term justice appears 5 times, temperance 2 times, fortitude 3 times, and then there are other that are connected, prudence 29 times. These are the 4 cardinal virtues. Prudence is very important, because prudence is practical wisdom. Okay, phronesis. Remember that one of the issues is, what is the relationship between phronesis and the individual virtues? And prudence appears 29 times. So, yes, it's practical wisdom and it's phronesis, and it denotes the ability to deliberate on the highest goods achievable by humans and to assess conflicts among the other virtues. This is the function of prudence. It's very important to understand what is the role of prudence in Machiavelli's virtue theory. So, he certainly accepts the theoretical pillars of virtue ethics. He's a particularist. There are not general rules. There are also only rules, the thumbs, and then you learn from specific cases. There is the centrality of the character. He always addresses this issue. Okay, what was the character of the people he mentions and discusses? And third, exemplarism. The print is, typical. Is really a collection of examples. So the 3 pillars of virtue ethics are applied to politics. Well, still, it disconnected virtue politics from virtue ethics. And look, these are 2. This is a very famous quotation. A prudent lord cannot observe fate, nor should he, when such observance turns against him, and the causes that made him promise have been eliminated. And if all men were good, this teaching would not be good. But because they are wicked, they are twisting. Do not observe faith with you. You also do not have to observe it with them. So, in some sense, this proves that he's using all the features of the specula to destroy this tradition from within. Because his final message is virtue politics is disconnected from virtue ethics. Okay, so really the opposite of all the specular tradition had done for, at that point, almost 1,000 years. So now I said that he fits all the pillars of virtue politics, even if in doing so, it disconnects virtue politics from virtue ethics, as James Hankins has argued so well in the Eastern Classic I mentioned before. So let's compare the humanistic virtue politics with Machiavelli virtue politics. So, as I said, the humanistic, I didn't say, but the humanistic view was that there is a strict connection between virtue politics and virtue ethics. Also, I would say that most humanists, or at least tended towards the Aristotelian view, that virtues are connected with each other. If you are virtuous in one field, you tend to be virtuous in other fields. This is the Aristotelian theory. Nowadays, now Russell defends this view. Well, Machiavelli, who disconnects virtue politics from virtue ethics, takes the opposite view. That's a view that Philippa Futa has defended in our own time, but Machiavelli also has it. His story is always of people who have some virtues, but unfortunately lack other virtues, because no one can have all the necessary virtue to survive in the political field. If you are very prudent, if you are very courageous, if you are very audacious, that's good in some time, not good in other times. You would need other virtues, yet you don't have. So it's a disunitarian in this respect. Second point, some people follow Aristotle even today, like Hackett, right? Virtues are habits, but not skills. They are different from skills. Skills require some procedures. They are not connected with the goal that we should pursue in ethics and other argumentations here. The Machiavellis arguing that virtues are skills, really. So you learn them as skills. Exactly, you have to be a skilled politician in order to be successful. There are techniques that you have to learn. Then, most, not all, but most humanists followed Aristotle in believing that behaving morally would mean to behave, take the middle ground between two opposite courses of actions. So being, you are too generous or you are too stingy, you have to be in the middle. That's the idea of Bruni, Palmieri, Pladina, Montano, Patrizi. Machiavelli has a different view. It goes back to Plato, as Lorenzo Valla had done, or the Christian tradition had done. There are vices, there are virtues, no middle ground, no golden mean, okay? And then the last one, that's most complicated, my opinion is the most important. So Aristotle, and nowadays Christian Christensen, defend this idea. There are the individual virtues, and that we have to learn them. We have to be trained in these virtues. And when there is a conflict, then there is this meta virtue, phronesis, that orchestrates that, decides, assesses the conflict there. And he also tells you where you should go, what is the goal of life. But the virtues are, there, out there. And this is another thing. Well, there is another view, Socrates, McDowell, and the Arete model nowadays defend this, that what really matters is phronesis, prudence, practical wisdom. All the individual virtues are only expressions of this meta-virtue, phronesis. And one way of putting it is this. The individual virtues are the ratio cognoscendi of phronesis. So the way we know phronesis is looking at behavior of people. Oh, he's brave, he's generous. But this is a way of knowing that a person has phronesis. And so they are the ratio cognoscendi. But phronesis is the ratio essendi of the individual virtues. So what really matters is prudence. It's prudence that really you need to have. And Machiavelli strikingly argued that way. First, let's read this passage. I know that everyone will confess that it would be a very praiseworthy thing to find in a prince all the above mentioned qualities that are held good. These are the traditional virtues. Unfortunately, because he cannot have them, the prince, nor wholly observe them, since human conditions do not permit it, it is necessary for him to be so prudent has to know how to avoid the infamy of those vices that would take his state from him, and to be on guard against this that do not, if that is possible. But if one cannot, one can let them go on with less hesitation. He has to be prudent. Okay, prudence is the real thing. There, you have to decide when you have to go against ethics because you have a superior political goal. And furthermore, one should not care about incurring the famed those vices without which it is difficult to save one's state. That's the goal, right? For if one considers everything well, one will find some things to be virtue, which, if it pursued, would be one's ruin. And something else appears to be vice, which, if pursued, results in one's security and well-being. So here you see, political virtues are different from ethical virtues. Even if you have to appear ethical, that's not the substance. The substance is you have to use your prudence. In some cases, you have to be unethical. But, Machiavelli is not a part of the Machiavellist movement. It's not that. Machiavelli is clear what he wants. When the entire safety of our country is at stake, no consideration of what is just or unjust, merciful or cruel, praiseworthy or shameful, must intervene. Think of Churchill. Churchill did explicitly said that I had to do terrible things to save our country. He sacrificed 1,000 soldiers because he had this main political goal to save the country from the Nazis. On the contrary, every other consideration being set aside, the course of law must be taken which preserves the existence of the country and maintains its liberty. That's what really matters. In those cases, virtue, politics, and prudence should tell you, forget about ethics, think about saving the state. Now, This is what Machiavelli says, and now I want to assess my last slide, one final issue. The humanist virtue politics is modeled on Aristotelian virtue ethics, while Machiavelli's, as I said, virtue politics is modeled on a Platonist approach. Whereas the humanists simply extended the ethical virtues to the political domain, Machiavelli reconceptualized virtue to suit the political realities he observed. This contrast stems from two radically different anthropologies. An optimistic one for the humanists, who saw humans as generally virtuous or capable of virtue, think later on Locke or Rousseau, and pessimistic one for Machiavelli, who saw humans as self-interested and requiring external constraints to control their behavior. Think about Hobbes or Carl Schmitt or Freud. Okay, now the question we can ask, I think, I'm a philosopher, so I ask questions. Who was right in this anthropological dispute about our own inner nature? The answer is easy. Neither or both. Now we know from science that we have both tendencies in us, and both are fundamental. There is a part of us that is conflictual, egoistic, and it is necessary at some point, up to a point. But there is another part that is altruistic, cooperative. There are incredible studies by Michael Tomasello about children, how they can tend to help people they do not know just out of altruism. So we have both tendencies in us. So what to do from a political point of view? I think we should take both from the humanist virtue politics and Machiavelli's virtue politics. We should try to have them combined because they are too unilateral about their assumptions about human anthropology. That is a complicated thing. But this is the subject for a different talk, I fear. Thank you very much.
So, I think if you don't mind, I'm going to sit down and read from my computer. I won't be reading, but I can't lecture weekly. I don't get, well, I came to weekly, lecture weekly, 90-degree angle. So, also my eyesight's strange. I need to blow up text. All right, so what I'm going to do is to talk about, these will be contiguous issues actually, about the issue of political modernity and where it comes from. Because Machiavelli, as you know, is often credited with being one of the great sources of political Straussianism. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Can you not hear me? I can bellow if you want. I'm very good at bellowing. I once lectured to 475 people, and I learned to bellow. So I can bellow. All right. So I'm going to engage with a couple texts. One is Gabriele Pedola's Machiavellian Tumult, which was originally published, I believe, in 2012, and then in Italian, and then translated in English, published by Cambridge in 2018. And the other is my colleague Eric Nelson's book on the Greek tradition, which is having a 20th anniversary this year. That's 2005. So Pedola gives, for the first time, I think, a detailed prehistory of a major aspect of political modernity, namely the ability of modern states to accommodate a plurality of conflicting opinions and interests within their political systems, without at the same time undermining their legitimacy. So modern politics does this by accepting as legitimate a moderate degree of nonviolent conflict between parties or classes of persons in a state, and by adopting, in principle anyway, procedural neutrality between them. The contrast that Pedola points out is with the pre-modern states, which were ideologically holistic and valued concord, stability, tranquility above all things, and where political parties are illegal. as you probably know. Political parties are regarded with extreme suspicion up until the 18th century even. So the pre-modern state saw all political conflict as illegitimate. If you were formed a party against the government, you were considered seditious, and you could be exiled or even killed. So in pre-modern conception, you should resort to conflict and violence only with extreme reluctance as a last resort in order to restore lost political order and virtues. Of course, if you look at the history of pre-modern republics, they're constantly fighting. This is not to say that there was a period of harmony and peace and order in the pre-modern republic, but that was, and maybe it's an equal and opposite reaction. They lived through such turbulence that they valued even more this idea of harmony and unity of opinions. So Pedro traces this positive evaluation of what he calls conflictualism back to Machiavelli's analysis of Roman Republican tumulti, above all in Discorsi 1:4. In this chapter, Machiavelli draws on his reading of Livy, Polybius, and surprisingly, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, to show how both the political freedom and the military might of Rome could be explained in great part by its positive forms of class conflict. So Roman statesmen endorsed the traditional prescriptions. If you read the Roman statesmen themselves, like Cicero, above all Cicero, they endorsed the traditional prescription for good civil order. For example, Cicero's idea of the Concordia Ordinum, which is basic to having a good state, conquered between, he's thinking of the senatorial order and the equestrian order. Nevertheless, as Machiavelli, the actual functioning of the Roman Republic benefited from a form of controlled conflict which is never fully accepted as legitimate by its own leaders. This is Machiavellian pursuit of effectual truth, right? So Rome's success as a state during the Middle Republic, before the collapse of the late Republic after 133 BC, was in fact the result of its political system's ability to make use of ordinary modes of political conflict, what Machiavelli calls the ordinary modes of political conflict, which include things like the successio of the plebs. The plebs don't like what's happening, they get up and leave. They refuse to work in the army. They refuse to participate. They form their own institutions. But this is all peaceful, but it's a form of dissent. But they don't fall into, this is key for both Pedro and Machiavelli, I think, they don't fall into extraordinary modes, destructive extraordinary modes of conflict involving bitter factionalism, violent uprising, civil war, mass exiles, assassination, proscription, and all these kind of violent modes of conflict. So Machiavelli contrasts these with Florence, which he's writing the history later on, of course, where he shows Florence provides all too many examples of the latter type of conflict in its history. So this distinction between the two types of conflict does much to explain the power and freedom of ancient Rome and the weakness and disguised tyranny that had made Florence a political failure for 2 centuries. That's really the message of the history of Florence. So Machiavelli's contention that not all conflict is bad, but moderate, ordered political conflict can be a positive force in republics, above all in the republics that have a mixed constitution. That's one of the sources of political modernity. And it's a very strong argument, I like it very much. So the way I'm going to engage with Pedro's Machiavellian tumult is to try to broaden the debate a bit about the origins of political modernity. So one consequence of accepting Pedro's argument is that the historian might be inclined to recognize Machiavelli's position as the fons et origo of political modernity, and therefore to consign the preceding humanist tradition to the previous age of the world, if you will, ante Machiavellum, or AM, that's my, all these, unfortunately all these abbreviations have been taken. Or maybe ante modernismus, modernismum, sorry, accusative case, While I agree in general that Machiavelli's thought represents a genuine revolution in the history of political morality, I agree with Petla on this in this issue. And I stated as much in Virtue Politics. I would not concede, and maybe Petla would not agree, would not concede either. I haven't discussed this issue with him. I would concede that Machiavelli's writings represent the only possible dividing line between AM and PM, between ante-modernism and postmodernism. So what follows, I'm going to argue that an author whom Petla and I both regard as unjustifiably neglected, namely Francesco Patrizi of Siena, might also be seen as falling on the modern side of the history of Western political thought, at least in one key respect. So I'm going to argue that Patrizi is more radical and more modern than Machiavelli in one very important respect. So this is Francesco Patrizi of Siena, 1494. Not Francesco Patrizi of Caro, who is a much more well-known figure today as a Platonist of the late 16th century. If you want to find out more about him, I've had a research team working on this for the last, since 2019. And if you look up Francesco Patrizi of Siena, you'll find our website. It's on the Harvard website, and it's got all sorts of information about him. We are eventually going to publish translations of his two major works. The reason he's been neglected is because he's in Latin. There's nine books on republics in Latin, 9 books in Latin on kingdom in Latin. And they're just stuffed with quotations. So any editor doesn't want to do that. But I've forced on I have some poor, unfortunate, very gifted undergraduates, so I've been getting to do all this work in the last 5 years. So this is, you should look at the website if you're interested in him. So an aspect of Patrizi's thought I'm thinking of concerns his teachings about private property, where Machiavelli is notably wimpy. Patrizi advocated economic reforms in the state that are a good deal more sweeping than those considered by Machiavelli for reasons I will describe later. The Sienese thinker aimed to use economic reforms to equalize political power among citizens, reduce the power of the wealthy, maintain a small professional army of native-born troops, and to secure a political dependence of the church on the state. So these are very radical reforms that he's proposing. In this respect, he would have to count as a predecessor and perhaps even a source for Thomas More's Utopia. I did an article on this, but I haven't really, well, we won't get into Thomas More's Utopia, but I consider him to be a predecessor of More's Utopia, as well as all later reformers and revolutionaries who saw the reshaping of property relations in states as the key to achieving stability and happiness. So Patrizi's interest in equalizing patrimonies has a different purpose. To be sure, he sees oligarchy, the power of the wealthy, as the chief obstacle to his preferred political system, which is a mixed regime of free and equal citizens ruled by virtuous magistrates. I call it political meritocracy. So in this, he's unlike his fellow humanists who promote moral education as their principal source of reform. He also differs from later utopians, especially those in the Marxist tradition. Marxist reformers and revolutionaries who want redistribution or even common ownership of property are more interested in achieving what they see as social and economic justice. Patrizi wants the state to be rich in order to empower the virtuous and prevent corruption and divided loyalty. So what he wants is to have a rich state and a not a rich state and a prosperous citizenry, but the state has to have more property than anybody else. So Patrizi's proposals to alter the economic structures that permit gross inequalities of wealth are made in Book 6 of his work, the De Institutione Rei Publicae, which I'm going to just call it De Republica or On Republics for the rest of the lecture because it's too long-winded otherwise. This is scribally published in 1471. Scribally published means a work that's written, copied in manuscript for a restricted audience. It's a common concept in English, which hasn't yet made its way into historians of political theory, but Machiavelli's two most famous works are privately published, right? Art of War was the only work on political theory published in his lifetime, but the other two works were really written for a small audience, and were not published till after his death. So Patrizi begins his treatment of property in Book 6 of the De Republica with the insistence that all good citizens must engage in honest work to support themselves and their families. There should be no rentier, nobody living in idleness on their incomes. That's what makes a good equality of state. So early at 1.4, while explicating Herodotus' debate of constitutions, he's the first author ever to look at this in Western since antiquity, Patrizi recognized a tight connection between citizen equality and the laudable desire for political liberty as characteristics of popular republics. So vast differences in wealth and power in a city not only made it unstable, which is Aristotle's objection, but they render citizen liberties meaningless. They propel a republic towards faction and then towards tyranny. So, like Aristotle, he's very concerned about income inequality, as we call it today, but he is mostly worried about the threat to liberty that is posed by income inequality. So usury, which gives rise to debt, is the major source for him of inequality, debt, basically. The vortex, I'm quoting now, the vortex of the usurer's greed drains the patrimony of many households, than which nothing is more destructive in a city, unquote. So, given that households are the bricks of the state in his conceptions, the state is made up of households. That's very Aristotelian, of course. So debt reduces many households to a state of dependence on the rich. It turns poor citizens into their servants and bondsmen. So that's where political inequality comes if you're dependent on a powerful, wealthy person in order to participate politically. And I think he's probably thinking of Cosimo de' Medici here, because in the way Cosimo gets political support is the people who haven't paid their debts are not eligible for political office. Cosimo pays their debts, and then they're eligible for political office, and then they're very grateful to the Medici, okay? So Patrizi knows about the Medici. He spent some time in exile in Pistoia, and he knows about that. So inequalities in landed wealth, which are still the principal source of wealth. You have to always remember that in pre-modern times, wealth comes from agriculture, right? 95%, well, at least 9, in some of the richer states it might be 90%. But basically it's 95% of all wealth is landed wealth. So inequalities in landed wealth are very pernicious. When the rich are able to control the vast majority of agricultural land, as in the Middle Roman Republic, they were able to drive the poor out of their little plots. Wealthy landowners, now talking about Roman Republic, wealthy landowners jacked up the price of grain, making it so expensive that the poor were forced to sell off what little remained of their patrimonies just to survive. Inequality undermines civic morality, and I'm quoting again, an excess of private wealth generally destroys cities, either through the pride and arrogance of the possessing classes or the rashness and insanity of the needy. So equality of means, on the other hand, when you have a citizenry which roughly equal means, then it makes it easier for law to constrain citizens and made the political device of sortition, the lot, which Patrizi endorses. He endorses a prudent use of the lot, which is combined with election in his meritocratic system. It makes that more acceptable. If you have people, if you're using the lot to select officers, you select your magistrates, and everyone's more or less politically, economically equal, and equal in terms of status, within a bandwidth here, then people will accept the lot. If you have some people who are incredibly wealthy, very high status, and then you have the working classes, then you don't get people to accept the lot. So he's thinking this is his prudence, right? This is an example of his prudence. So it's Patrizi's awareness of the evil caused by economic inequality, when combined with his study of Greek philosophy, that brought him to accept the need for the state to exercise some control over the distribution of wealth. He begins by considering the most radical Greek proposal of all, of redistribution, which is Plato's proposal in the Republic for the class of guardians to own all their land in common and prohibit private patronage. Patrizi rules this out as untried and therefore imprudent. So Bernie's form of prudence is to say you shouldn't do anything that's never been tried. So he's anti-utopian in this sense, right? Or he's against thinking up untried solutions to things. And he includes in this the communio muriero, right? The common ownership of property and lives, because they've never been tried. And a prudent person only institutes things that have been tried and tested by historical experience. So this is part of his historically based method of prudence, which I'm calling historico-prudential method in the book on Patrizi I wrote. But the idea is that instead of basing prudence on Aristotelian doctrine, which is what Giles of Rome does in the most popular scholastic treatise of politics, which is the Evrigenis argument, Patrizi bases his prudence on historical examples, and he can do so because he knows Greek and has absorbed vast amounts of Greek history and Greek political theory, which were previously unknown in the West. He's the first political theorist ever to reflect on Greek history. But it's not just Greco-Roman history, it's also other cultures. He is interested in ancient Egyptian history, and Persian history, and he's interested in Hindu history and Indian history. He has some sources, Greek sources, that tell him about those systems. So he's trying to gather together all of the historical information about political systems, and then test his decisions test his prudence on all those examples. Later on, when Patrizi has followers in the 16th century, he has many followers in the 16th century, they start getting interested in China. Right? When the Jesuits go to China, they want all that information to be included in their prudence. Okay. So, Patrizi rules out Plato's common ownership of property for guardians. He's much more attracted by two legislative schemes for the equalization of patrimonies that are mentioned by Aristotle in Book 2 of the Politics, those of Phalius of Carthage and Hippodamus of Miletus. This is Book 2 of Politics. Aristotle, however, is relentlessly critical of both of these programs for equalizing property. So what Aristotle does is says this is not going to work because the real source of the problem with inequality is in the soul. So Aristotle says the beginning of reform is not so much to equalize property as to train the nobler sort of natures not to desire more, to prevent the lower natures from getting more. That is to say, they must be kept down but not ill-treated. So, the problem is not inequality of wealth, it's not some external arrangement of property, but the problem is the upper classes wanting wealth, right? You got to redirect their moral impulses to higher things. So Patrizi, who knows Aristotle very well, he almost never mentions Aristotle because he considers himself a rival of Aristotle. He examines both of these schemes in Book 2 of the Politics, Phalius and Hippodamus schemes. He disagrees, so he's reading against the grain of Aristotle. So he writes about Phalius. He's the first to recommend that citizens should have private but equal patrimony. This is a form of distributism, if you know what that is. So I'm quoting Patrizi now. This idea is not unreasonable. Everybody agrees that there is nothing that preserves the Republic more than equality among citizens, which is seen most of all when there are neither rich nor poor in the city, but when citizens are assessed with equal land and equal patrimonies. As Aristotle affirms, equalizing patrimonies when the city is first founded, that's an important distinction, is not hard to do and brings no small benefit. An allotment of this kind would tend to equality, and human negligence and baseness could easily be restrained by the laws. Many states did not permit patrimonies to be alienated. Solon, we love Solon. Solon passed a law to this effect and the popular tribune Voconius among the Romans passed a law preventing private fortunes from being left to female heirs. So Patrizi displays considerably more enthusiasm for distributism than Aristotle. To put it mildly, Aristotle is not a distributivist. Patrizi's positive attitude is striking, given the overwhelming authority in the Quattrocento of Aristotle's economic thought and his conservative attitude to property. There's a kind of idem satira here with the Romans. The Romans, of course, thought that private property was absolutely essential for peace in the republic, and it's protected by law in the first century BC already. But the only other humanist thinker I know to discuss this passage was Lauro Carini, who's a Venetian patrician, who parrots Aristotle's line that distributist legislation might be viable in a newly founded state, but with superficial solution to deeper moral problems of avarice. This is a way of claiming that moral education, not state intervention in the economy, but moral education, is the only viable solution to inequalities of wealth. This is the default position of humanist political thought. Almost all humanists who are following Aristotle, following Roman example, they don't want redistribution. They don't want distributivism. They don't want the state to mess around with private property at all. But Patrizi is different. So Quirini, this is Venetian political theorist, adds that equalization of property would limit business enterprise and stunt artistic ambition, since there would be no financial motive for individuals to engage in commercial activities and develop artistic excellence. So that should sound familiar to you. Even more attractive, Patrizi were schemes for allocating the city-state's land, which is proposed by Hippodamus and Miletus. He discusses these, and this is from Aristotle again, which are discussed in his text that David Book 6. Throughout his discussion of Hippodamus, the Sienese philosopher reads firmly again against the grain of Aristotle's criticism. In 6.2, we encounter Hippodamus' tripartite division of landed property, which Patrizi endorses. Okay? This is what he thinks, if you're founding a new state, this is what you should do. And he says, not that we have followed him in every respect, but we have not strayed far from his example, hence it will be relevant to take from this authority the division of the city's territory and lands. So according to Hippodamus, the sum of landed property in the city-state should be divided into 3 parts. 1/3 should go to the sacred uses, 1/3 goes to public use, and 1/3 goes to private individuals. And this is the Hippodamian division of property. So Patrizi likes this, again, for newly founded republics, not for existing republics. The allocation so large a portion of the city's financial resources for sacred purposes is elaborately justified, citing several other authorities, including Queen Isis of Egypt, whom Patrizi thinks is a real figure. She knows through Diodorus Siculus, Aristotle, and Romulus. Is Romulus the founder of Rome? That's what the founder of Rome did. So this sounds crazy to us because, giving 1/3 of the land to church, what are you talking about? But what you have to realize is that when Patrizi's writing, the church already has 1/3 of the land in Europe. The private owners of 1/3 of the land in Europe. And it can be anywhere, in southern Italy, it's even higher, right? So this is not a revolutionary proposal for his own time. But what is revolutionary is to say that the land shouldn't be owned by the church, but should be owned by the state, at least out to the church. Okay, so as Bishop of Gaeta, Patrizi is himself, he's a bishop of Gaeta in southern Italy, which is a nice little port town in the kingdom of Naples. Patrizi was himself the beneficiary of lands appropriated for sacred uses, so it's not surprising that he approves of the Hippodamian division. So Patrizi adopts this proposal that ecclesiastical institutions should be understood, or at least their property should be controlled by the state. Okay? And the only thing that the church retains, now I'm a little speculating because some of this is very carefully expressed, because Patrizi is not only Bishop of Gaeta, but he's a protege of Pope Pius II, right? So you argue against the ecclesiastical ownership of property, you're going to find yourself in hot water. But there is an era of challenge. So when he finally published this text, by the way, in 1471, Pius II is dead, and there's another pope, and the pope is Sixtus IV, who is a Franciscan, and Franciscans have a much more, let's say, broad-minded. They have a much more flexible attitude toward private property than Pius II. Okay, so. All right, so key move here is Patrizi city would retain ownership of the land, and income from permanent leases would be paid for the upkeep of churches and to provide a modest, non-heritable living for priests. So basically, the state is providing the benefits, not the church. So sharecroppers are going to support the clergy by payments to them in kind or in specie, either directly or via the state treasury. So in other words, state control of the agricultural property is used to support religion, but this goes well beyond the situation. He's really challenging openly the Gregorian reform of the late 11th and early 12th century, which established the right of the church to control property against the political authorities in the Holy Roman Empire. So in canon law, the founders of churches, even princes, are able to have certain rights, the rights of looking after the church, giving advice, being consulted, to find or provide a priest, but they did not have the use vendendi or donandi, well, utendi tam propria is the right of selling and giving or using this as their own. So basically, lay owners of property give their property to the church, lose all control over it. It's like giving money to a university, exactly the same thing. You give the money to the university, and the church says, the university says, thank you very much. We will we'll be happy to read what you say you would like the purposes of your gift to be used for, but we, especially after the death of the giver, will now ignore everything you want the money to be used for. So this is the position of the medieval church, that you give land to the church, and everyone's giving land to the church, right? So Pius gift. You lose control. So Patrizi is trying to change this. This is a huge reform that he has in mind. So it would bring to an end Gregorian reform in the 11th century and overturn a position stated in the First Lateran Council of 1123, attempts by laymen to claim dispositio or dominatio, lordship, of ecclesiastical possessions as sacrilegious. Okay, so he's going up against a canon of the Lateran Council, and they know these canons very well. These are handed down in canon law textbooks, which are studied in universities. So he's not saying anything that is unknown. He's not really jousting against some provision lost in the depths of history. These are things that people know about. So he, by implication, rejects the canons prohibiting laymen, including lay rulers, from having dominion in churches, exercising dominativa potestas, the power of ownership or lordship that enable ecclesiastical lordship. So he's against ecclesiastical lordship, okay, the sovereign ownership of property by church lords, archbishops, abbeys, cathedral chapters, and so forth. So Patrizi's solution to the problem of church-state conflict resembles his solution to the problem of oligarchy, and it's every bit as radical. By limiting the amount of private wealth the church could command and making the clergy economically dependent on the state, he's going to reduce the ability of the church to challenge the public authority, and put an end to all of the quarreling between church and state, which is so important feature of late medieval history. Okay, so that's the first one. How much time do we have, Nikki? I'm not sure. 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So the second portion, city's landed property, Patrizi wants to use for secular but public purposes, and principally to support the city's armed forces. Okay, so the second third of land is, again, public land, but he's going to use it for two purposes. One is to support the small but professional armies. These are not militiamen, these are professional troops. They choose citizens at the age of, in their teen years, who are very good at physical exercise. He's going to train them as professional soldiers, and the state is going to have, and he's thinking really of Siena here, they're going to have a small professional army, full-time, supported on state land, okay? And Venice is doing things like this in the period, so it's not entirely original with him, but it is original for a political theorist to talk about it, right? So that's one use of it. The other use is to free the poor from debt. Because he sees that the reason why the oligarchs have so much power is they have control over the wealth, which gives them control over the poor. The poor are always in debt. And so how do we break the nexus between the oligarchs and debt? We support the poor from public lands, right? And what the poor are going to do is they're going to farm. They're going to be given farmland, and they're going to work the farmland. And maybe some of them will be supporting the soldiers. It's really not quite clear exactly how this works, but it's clear that's what he wants to do with this land. He wants to use it to support the military and to give the poor some kind of protection from the rich. And then there's another set of proposals about what to do about the rich. And this is a proposal to limit profits, limit the amount that the rich can earn. So he's not abolishing private property. The third part of the land is given to, split up among private individuals, and in the initial distribution, everyone gets the same amount. And so people can earn their own income from private property, but if they get to a certain point, they have to stop. If they're, this is maybe a bit influenced by Plato's laws, because he knows Plato's laws. He's one of the first people to know Plato's laws. But he wants to limit the amount of money the rich can make. They can make lots of money, but they're not supposed to make too much money. And if the poor get too poor, then they're given land. Right? You could also maybe point to ancient Deuteronomy, one of the defined sources. There's going to be equalization of land. But one thing that doesn't happen is that you don't get redistribution. And the argument here sounds incredible. It sounds to me like Robert Nozick, okay? Because what he says, it's a justice argument, that if we had an initial distribution of land, and after 10 years we go back, some people will be much richer and some people will be much poorer, because people are different. Some people are lazy, some people are confident. If at that point you were to redistribute the land, you would be doing an injustice, because the people who had earned an excessive wealth through their, through hard labor, through their work, they would be, you can't take that away from them and give them to people who have been lazy. What you can do is create boundaries, upper boundaries and lower boundaries, and that's what he wants to do. You can only earn so much money. And Plato has this thing in the laws where the rich are supposed to be, I forget what it is, 5 times as rich as the next class below them. That's what he wants to do. And he's getting it, I can't prove that he's getting it from Plato, I think. That's the obvious source. Okay, I will end up. This principle should carefully be observed. The greater part of the city's domain should belong to the public, while the lesser part should be private. So this is what happens if you have founding a new republic. And I believe what is actually going on with this text is that at the same time he's writing this, he's assigned to write this by Pope Pius II. Pope Pius II is building a new city called Pienza, named after himself, as always with the popes. It's his hometown, which is more or less deserted by this time, and he's forcing all his cardinals to build palaces in Pienza, and he hires Lambattista Alberti, the architect, to redesign the city so it's a Renaissance ideal city. And he then, I believe this is connected with Patrizi, who is saying, Patrizi write me a political theory based on the Greek, and we'll have an ideal city. So Patrizi, I think this is a demonstration. I think it's part of Pienza as the demonstration project. Siena is a few miles to the north, and Pope Pius II is from a family that's been exiled from power in Siena for a long time, and he despises the way Siena is run. So I think he's got this little demonstration project going in Pienza, and he says, Patrizi, write me a political theory for my ideal city. I can't prove this, but there are other people, I'm not the only person who say this, there's an architectural historian. in London. Francesco, memory problems. But there's an architectural historian in London who has gone through book 8 of the De Republica, where Patrizi designs a urban structure designs an urban space. He has an urban planning document where he tells you how to build a city, and there's alignment with Pienza. So that's the best evidence I know that this text is written for as a demonstration project. All right, so I will end up. I will make a point, Joe, just briefly, that he doesn't think this is going to work with the established republic because things are already too corrupt with established republics. So what you have to do is to kind of move in that direction, try to limit the power of the wealthy, but it's going to be much harder. He's got some solutions to that, which I'm not going to go into, but it's a much harder job to reform an established government. Okay, it should by now be clear that Patrizi's approach to the problem of inequality in republics is far more radical, and in a certain sense far more modern than Machiavelli's. Machiavelli starts from the assumption that human nature is invariant and capable of moral improvement, everyone's self-interested. You can make human beings individually and collectively more powerful, more effective, more virtuous in this demoralized Machiavellian sense by using the coercive power of laws, institutions, and instrumentalized religious practices. But you can never accomplish the goal of humanist virtue politics, which is raising to power a well-educated class of persons of who are wise, prudent, and have good character. You're never going to get this because for Machiavelli, you have these two fundamental human humors, those who want to rule and those who desire not to be ruled. So if your city's in a corrupt state, it's fallen into extraordinary modes of conflict. There are only two possibilities. Either you'll be conquered by a predatory state that's less corrupt than yours, or you must take your state back to its original institutions by using the mode of Ioannis, Discourses 1:9, the Spartan king who tried to restore the laws of Lycurgus by slaughtering all the ephors and his other political opponents. So Machiavelli stops short saying, we got to do the mode of that. He doesn't say that, but he doesn't quite take it off the table either. So even so, his only solutions to the problem of unequal economic power are to advocate increasing the wealth of the state and to legitimate a greater degree of conflict between rich and poor. His solutions found many adherents in later times with the results that we see around us. Whether his success should be a matter for celebration and national pride is another question. I have 2 more minutes?
One more minute.
So for Patrizi, his forms of equality will enable true liberty, the kind of liberty that defers to legitimate authority, but resists the arrogance of private individuals who have lordly ways. Machiavelli, as a realist, is necessarily conservative in the Augustinian sense. He believes that wickedness can only be managed, it can't be removed from power. Patrizi is an idealist, but he's not a utopian. He certainly did not believe perfection was possible in human things, but he was an idealist in this sense. He believed that by consulting the wisdom of classical antiquity, not just Greco-Roman, all classical antiquity, existing customs and political regimes could be greatly improved and optimized. Like Thomas More in the Utopia, he claimed to be designing an optimus status rei publicae, the best constitution for a state. Though in his case, not in jest, but in earnest. Okay, I'll stop there. Have a nice time.
don't trust myself to project sitting down. And I also don't trust myself to stay within the time limit. Therefore, I am going to read something that's prepared. And I'm going. My name starts with a Z, so I always expect to go.
This case, that's
Yeah.
easy, right? If it works. You are the expert, Ioannis.
It's not.
No,
Can you
no.
move the microphone?
Okay. I need this? All right. I'll try to remember to keep it within range. Okay. As you may be gathering, we each have a limited amount of time, and I thought that I would be able to present a very short story of Machiavelli's in this limited amount of time. My presentation should have been called, I think, Machiavelli at Play. What I discovered was there are so many references. It's about 5 pages printed short story, but I can't tell you about any of them. You have to read the short story and you'll find out that the names mean something. Professor Caro suggested that there is a similarity or compatibility between Plato and Machiavelli. In the world in which I usually live, there often seem to be opposites. And so Plato's name is, as you know, associated with a certain kind of love. Machiavelli's name, on the other hand, is associated with Machiavellian politics. That is the use of force and fraud in politics. And there's some justification for that. In The Prince, Machiavelli famously writes that a political leader will want to be both loved and feared. However, because it is difficult to put them both together, it's safer to be feared than loved. In the book I wrote on Machiavelli's politics, I argued that Machiavelli is also interested not just in the means of the fox and the lion, but in the way of fighting characteristic of human beings, which is with laws. I also argued that he didn't just write famous treatises on politics. He also wrote poems, songs, comedies, and one, but only one, short story. As I said, I thought under these circumstances I could talk about the short story, which has the advantage of being brief, and it's also fairly amusing, although I'm not confident of my ability to bring that out. So, the fable of Belfagor, the devil who took a wife. It was first published in an edition of Machiavelli's collected works in 1549, so it was not well known during his lifetime. And I don't think it's too well known to this day. No one knows why he wrote it, when he wrote it, or where he wrote it. No prologue, no preface, no context. And unlike his other works, it doesn't have a dedication. He begins by relating that, or claiming that he's relating the vision of a very saintly man, recorded in the ancient chronicles of Florence. The saintly man had a vision of hell in which he saw troops of souls descending. And these souls were complaining. I don't know whether souls have gender, but these had to be male souls because they said, you know the story, I wouldn't have angered God and been damned if I hadn't gotten married. Now, in Machiavelli's picture of hell, it's ruled by Pluto, the god of wealth in Greece. And the judges are 2 of the judges, Homer and Virgil, depict in Hades, Rhadamanthus and Minos. And I guess these judges just forgot about the role of Helen in the Trojan War. The Odyssey does have something to do with that, as does the Aeneid. But in any case, they can't believe this scandal against the female sex. But more and more and more of these souls came down to hell with the complaints. So these 2 judges go to Pluto and they say, oh, what are we going to do? Pluto calls a meeting of the devil princes in hell. And he explains to the princes, first, he has absolute power, can't be qualified by anything in heaven or on earth. But he knows that a wise or a prudent prince rules with laws and takes the advice of other people. So he has come to his Senate, in effect, to ask their advice. What should I do about all of these souls and their complaints? Because you see, if I let them off, people are going to think I'm weak and unjust. But if I condemn them and punish them, I'm going to be blamed for being harsh and unjust. So I need your advice, devils, about what to do. And so the devils, being good counselors, and they are an assembly, they have a discussion, and a majority vote that what they should do is they should send a representative to Earth to find out what the truth of the matter is. Now, there was a minority of the devils who thought it would be much more efficient just to torture the souls who would come down and get the truth out of them, but they lost the vote. So what Machiavelli does, in effect, with mixing the Christian and the pagan references, is to suggest that the government in hell is a lot better than any of the governments or life on earth. The devils want to send a representative. Nobody volunteers. It's better to live there than it is to live here. So they choose their representative by lot. And Belfagor, who lives in Archdale, draws the lot. So he and the assembly and Pluto agree that he will go to Earth in the form of a human being, a young man. He will go with 100,000 gold ducats, so he'll be very wealthy, and he'll have a retinue of devils as servants and horsemen. And what he's supposed to do is he's supposed to live there. I missed the important point. Anyway, he's supposed to live on Earth, taking a wife, and he's to be subject to, here's a human body, all the trials of human existence. Imprisonment, poverty, passions. Not death, of course, because he's a devil and immortal. And then after 10 years, he's supposed to feign his death and come back to hell to report on what the truth of the matter is. What he didn't say, and I should have said, is that the government we see in hell is a model of the kind of government Machiavelli recommends a prince should adopt. Both in the Prince 19, should copy the King of France, rule by laws, get other people to do your dirty work, and in Discourses 116. So, good government in hell, find out what's going on. So Belfagor enters the world in the body of a handsome young man, 30 years old, accompanied by his devilish retinue of servants, lots of wealthy, and he chooses to live in Florence. Why does he choose Florence? He thinks it's the best place to practice usury. Condemned by both Aristotle and the church. But bankers like the Benedictine did pretty well in Florence, so there's a reason for his choice. He takes the name of Rodrigo of Castile with a fictional life story. He was born in Spain, but his parents took him to Syria. He made his fortune there, and now he's come to Italy, a much more humane place to find a wife. His initial good looks, liberality, spreads his money around, and apparent humanity mean that all the fathers of Florence who have daughters but don't have enough money to pay the dowries come and introduce them to Rodrigo as possible mates. He chooses a very beautiful girl from an old but poor Florentine family. Her name is Onesta. Onesta is the word for decency, said to be characteristic of the people and the prince, but it's also derived from honestum, which is the word Cicero uses for virtue in De Officiis. So what Machiavelli keeps doing is weaving these two things together. Part one of the story, hell. Part two of the story, what happens in Florence. Machiavelli describes the way in which Rodrigo's marriage leads to his impoverishment and possible imprisonment. The devil organized, he has lots of money, a splendid wedding. And the narrator tells us that's since Rodrigo was subject to all human passions. He really enjoyed the kind of adulation wealth and status gives one. Moreover, he soon fell in love with his wife, Madame Onesta, beyond measure, so he felt he just couldn't displease her in any way. Unfortunately, despite her name, Onesta proves to be not so noble or honest, but very proud, prouder than Lucifer, the devil decides, and he adjusts, or he's seen both. And perceiving how much her husband loved her, she starts ordering him around. And when he doesn't do what she says, she insults him. Well, that made him rather unhappy, of course. But his respect for his father-in-law, her brothers, relatives, the obligations of marriage, and his love, above all, for his wife, led him to spend all the gold ducats that he had brought with him and to go to some of the bankers in Florence to get loans. So when they hear that her two brothers have lost their money, one through gambling and the other one through sending an uninsured ship back to Florence, the creditors know, and Rodrigo knows, that he's destitute. Notes haven't come due yet, so they can't yet take legal action, but they watch over him carefully. And Rodrigo's, what should I do? Well, a part of his agreement with Pluto and the devils in Hades was that he had to suffer all of the indignities and pains of human existence. Thus, he could make his way out with his wit and deceive them. So, when he decides there's no remedy but to get on a horse and ride out of Florence. Well, the creditors are watching. As soon as they see what he's going to do, they go to the magistrates send couriers, and a whole crowd of people is following Rodrigo out of Florence into the countryside. Just comment, it doesn't look as if there's much popular sympathy among the people of Florence for debtors. Maybe because in this case he had been a wealthy usurer beforehand. In any case, Rodrigo doesn't get very far. There are ditches, so the land is flat. He showed up on horseback. He ditches the horses and starts running across the fields on land, and he comes across a peasant whose name is Gian Matteo, who lives in a kind of hovel, and Rodrigo comes and says, save me, and I'll reward you." So what Machiavelli describes the peasant as a spirited man. And he thought, well, what do I have to lose by helping this guy? So what he does is he pushes it into a pile of manure in front of his house. And there Rodrigo sits. The couriers and the people arrive not very long after that, and they berate the peasant and say, haven't you seen them? There was a fugitive who passed by. And Johnny says, no. So the Florentines give up and go back to Florence after a day, and Gian Matteo goes then to call to Rodrigo, come out of the manure. And Rodrigo comes out with no complaints about his hiding place. And time was of the essence. And maybe he got used to slinky things living in hell. In any case, he says, I'm in your debt, Gian Matteo, and I want to compensate you for it. So first, let me tell you who I am. I am a devil, not a human being. And I will compensate you. And so I agreed with my fellows in hell, and he explains the agreement to come to Earth to get married and to see what it's really like to be married. He tells him what it was like in his experience to be married, and he is going to reward Matteo by making him rich. So then he tells him how he's going to do that. He says, wait, when you hear that a woman in the neighborhood has been possessed, you'll know that it is I, the devil. And you can go to the woman's father or family, and you can demand whatever you want to exercise the spirit. So, okay, sounds good. He and Rodrigo agreed that that's what they're going to do. A couple of days, a week later, Gian Matteo hears that the daughter of a noble Florentine has been possessed. And he hears that the family has tried all the traditional remedies, and the devil has a good time. So to show that he's not an ordinary spirit possessing her, he has her speak in Latin, to engage in philosophical debates, and reveals some of the secrets of people in Florence, including a friar who has kept a novice in his cell for 4 years for his sake of his pleasure. So Gian Matteo comes and he does a few imitation religious rites, and then he asks Rodrigo to leave. He does. The father pays Gian Matteo what he asks, which is 400 florentines. He wants the 400 florentines because that's the amount it will take him to buy the land that he's been working without owning it. So the ambition of the peasant is just to own his own land and be his own boss. But the devil tells him, and part of the backstory is that Belfagor in medieval times was famous for doing this particular devil. That's not enough. That's not going to make you rich. So let me tell you, I'm going to go to Charles, the King of Naples, and I'm going to possess his daughter. And you can come and exercise with me from her, and you can ask whatever you want. So this time, Gian Matteo goes to Naples, and he's becoming well known now. You see, first he did something in Florence, and now he goes to Naples, so he gets a reputation as an exorcist. And this time he asks for 50,000 ducats and gets them. And so Gian Matteo thinks, well, okay, now I'm going to go home to Florence, and I'm going to live in peace and quiet. But the devil warns him. He says, okay, I've now fulfilled my bargain. It's just citizen of hell. I've made you rich. But if I ever see you again, I'm going to be as harmful to you as I have been helpful thus far. Well, Rodrigo or the devil doesn't leave their next meeting to chance. Instead, he goes to Paris. He's, the high life, like the Machiavelli society. And he possesses the daughter of the King of France. And the King of France now has heard about this ability of Gian Matteo to take care of such situations. So he first sends a message to Gian Matteo. And Gian Matteo, knowing it's not going to work this time. So he says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just not feeling well. I can't make the journey. And you know how well the King of France would take such a response. He got in touch with the authorities in Florence, and somehow Gino Matteo ended up in Paris. But Gino Matteo doesn't despair. He thinks he's going to fail, but he takes courage and he first whispers in the girl's ear. And of course, he's talking to Rodrigo inside, and he says, "Oh, please, don't you remember I helped you? Don't do this." And the devil says, "Who do you think you are? You've been running around the countryside saying that you got wealthy because you got the services of me, the devil. And I don't like that. So I am going to stay here and see you hanged." Gino Matteo is understandably then frightened, but he's a resourceful fellow. So he goes to the King of France and he says, "Oh, dear King, I told you that there are some demons who are so malicious that you can't deal with them. But will you please join me in a final experiment?" And so the king, who of course wants to get his daughter cured, says, "Okay." And the king agrees to build a huge platform in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, big enough to hold all the nobility of Paris. And on this platform, there's also going to be a big altar so they can hold a mass there before the exorcism is to take place. And they do that the next weekend. And then Gino Matteo also asked the king, "When the exorcism is taking place, I'll do a few rituals, but I want you to arrange for there to be a band there of at least 20 men playing very noisy instruments, cymbals, drums, horns, etc. The king agrees. So the devil, looking out, thinks to himself, "What's going on here? Why are all these people here? Doesn't this stupid, lazy peasant know I've seen the pomp of heaven and the pomp of hell. He's not going to frighten me." And so he watches the mass, and he watches Gino Matteo talk to the woman. And then Gino Matteo raises his hand in his hat, and the band, making this huge noise, starts marching. So Gino Matteo, "What's going on?" And Gino Matteo responds, "This is your wife coming to claim you." At that moment, the narrator tells us, a miraculous change occurred in Rodrigo. He left immediately, leaving the princess good and healthy. And so the narrator tells us, well, he doesn't tell us this. First, Machiavelli asks us to think. How possible was it, or probable, that Rodrigo's wife from Florence would have come to Paris to reclaim the husband who left her in penury and ran away? That's one. If, for some reason, she had wanted him back, wouldn't she have gone to the magistrates of Florence and asked them to go get her husband? But no. Would she really have been marching down the road with a band to get him? She doesn't know where he is. So, of course, this is ridiculous. But we are to think that the experience that Rodrigo had with his scolding wife was so bad that he doesn't want to go back. And the narrator informs us, and I quote, from the English translation. Belfagor returned to hell and bore witness that the ills that wives brought on a house, and Machiavelli's description of the beneficent government of hell at the beginning of the story leads us to believe that his testimony would convince the judges to let off all these souls who had complained about their wives being the source of their sins. And Belfagor would have all of the devils who had initially come with him to back up his testimony because they all left instead of living in the household. But if we readers just sit back and think for a minute, if that judgment had gone through, that would have amounted to the erasure of most, if not all, of original sin. So this is a revolution in hell that would have caused, I think, a revolution in earth. This is Machiavelli's plan. But Belfagor doesn't have the last word in Machiavelli's story. The very last sentence, the narrator reports, and I have lost it here, Giametta, who knew more about these things than the devil, went home peacefully and happily. And so if we ask ourselves, what did Giametta know about these things, and what are these things that the devil didn't? I think the first thing he knows is that he's a human being. He has a body, and he's immortal. He suffers from the fear of death. There is no suggestion in the story that he is married or that he has any intention of becoming so. He was too poor before, basically, to get married. What has the peasant experienced? He's experienced poverty. He has experienced two governments, first Florence and then France, who have asked him to do an improbable, if not impossible, feat and threatened to kill him if he didn't. So Giametta knows that there are worse sources of suffering than a scolding wife. This story is usually taken to be an example of Machiavelli's misogyny. He's the man who says at the end of Prince 25, fortune is a woman, and if you want to master her, you've got to beat her and stamp her down. Rodrigo didn't get that advice. But this story does not actually support, I think, the proposition that wives are responsible for all sins. If you asked, why did Rodrigo become impoverished? Why did he flee imprisonment? Was that really the force of his wife, or the fault of his wife simply? Wasn't it the case that he also enjoyed the pomp and having people look up to him? Wasn't it the case that he couldn't say no to her or to her family? Wasn't it the case that he wasn't able to control his own passions? And they aren't, in this case, they don't seem to be predominantly sexual. Worst of all, the devil had agreed to suffer the inconveniences, to use a Machiavellian term, of the human condition. But it was okay for him to escape if he could think of a way out. But the devil isn't clever enough to think of the way out himself. It's the peasant who is resourceful enough and inventive enough to think of the way the devil escapes from the Florentine magistrates and to think of the way he can escape from the snares of the devil. But my final word on this story is, because I think Machiavelli flips everything as he goes through, it's very ironic. Gio Matteo may have unintentionally saved the souls of men from damnation, not a small achievement. But he isn't a hero. He did not save the souls because he intended to do so. He did not act, in the case of Rodrigo or of the women Rodrigo possessed, out of compassion for their suffering. In all cases, he acted out of his own self-interest. He doesn't seek fame or reputation, as Rodrigo accused him. He's found that fame and reputation get him into trouble. He just wants to go home and have his own home. So, like the common people, according to Machiavelli in Prince 9 and Discourses 1-4, Gio Matteo wishes not to be commanded and oppressed. He doesn't want, like the Grandi, to oppress and command others. So I think if there is a moral to Machiavelli's story, it is that we should respect the practical acumen, resourcefulness, and courage of the common man. But we shouldn't expect too much of him. And that's my dig at John McCormack. There is a reason Machiavelli addresses his longer, more serious works to potential leaders, despite what he knows about their avarice, ambition, and rapacity. Thank you.
So I'm hoping you can hear me, but tell me if you can't. First of all, I want to thank Professor Sullivan for organizing this and for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. She played a big role in the society and also in the behind-the-scenes organization of the first conference of the International Machiavelli Society, and unfortunately didn't make it to the conference. And so we felt her presence there, and I'm glad that she's able to continue the activities of the society, which Machiavellians everywhere desperately need. So I'm simultaneously happy and sad. I'm sad because, despite the fact that my name doesn't start with Z, she placed me last on this schedule, which means that I have very hard acts to follow. And I'm happy because all of the previous speakers raised issues that are relevant to what I'd like to say. I'm also happy because I see many friendly faces, because if there weren't friendly faces, I would be very reluctant to try what I'm going to try to do. And the reason why I'd be reluctant is because for a very long time I thought that the topic that I'm about to take up is self-evident and presumably very well treated by scholars of Machiavelli. But real experts of Machiavelli, whom I consulted, assure me that that's not the case. And so I'm hoping that Professor Zuckert can correct me. But Professor Sullivan, Gabriele Bedula, and other people have noted that there's no real sustained treatment of Machiavellian psychology. Almost everybody has something to say about Machiavellian psychology when they write about any topic in Machiavelli, but there's no sustained treatment of Machiavellian psychology. And so I wanted to take an initial stab at Machiavellian psychology. Now, the first thing to say is that in using the term psychology, I am cheating because, first of all, while Machiavelli, and I'm going to be focusing on the Prince, but this is largely true of the discourses as well, he uses the term animo and the term mente to refer to the mind, but as Mansfield points out at the beginning of his translation, he never uses the term anima, which refers to the soul. And so psychology is a little bit of a strange term for somebody who doesn't have any interest in the soul. And so it's an anachronistic use in the sense that I'm using it in the way that a layperson might understand it today, to refer to this nexus of the mind/soul, although many people don't even believe that there is a soul. So it's psychology in this rather mundane sense, as relating to the way the human mind works and how somebody needs to take that into account in order to think about politics and especially practice politics. It seems to me that in a very basic sense there's a sophisticated theory of the mind at work in what he does. And Mario put up some of the passages that begin to indicate that in The Prince, and I'll refer to a couple of those. But it struck me that maybe the best thing to do is not simply to refer to generalities about how this happens in The Prince, but to pinpoint a particular instance in which he himself describes himself as doing what I'm proposing he's doing. And so one of these instances is in chapter 18, not too far from the passage that Mario read earlier, in which he says that there are some people who know, quote, how to get around men's brains with their astuteness. Okay, so he's identifying the human mind as having some agency, and the political actor as having some ability to get around that mind with his astuteness. So what I wanted to do is take a very small case study from The Prince and show you how you might think about it in psychological terms, and then also indicate some other instances that might complement that if one were to think about a systematic treatment of Machiavellian psychology in The Prince and the discourses. So the case study is a thread that runs through both The Prince and discourses, and I believe both Jim and Mario have referred to this issue. At the beginning of book 3, there is the famous reference to returning cities back to their beginnings, and in particular to recreating the psychology that was characteristic of cities in the beginning. And so the question is, what is that psychology? And broadly speaking, what that means is to remind people of what their priorities are, which may have shifted as they become more comfortable, to remind them of the source of power and the source of protection, and to sort of recenter them and make them focus on what really matters. And he gives the example of the Medici doing this every few years in Florence. You know, one can imagine, some of my former students have heard me say this, you can imagine the president showing up to a meeting at the State Department, and the staircases are aligned with the staff of the State Department, and everybody claps when the president comes in, and the first thing he does is he orders that the Secretary of State be hanged and that the janitor be made Secretary of State. And of course the idea is that there's some unpredictability that allows the holder of power to demonstrate the source of that power, and also to keep people on their toes. And it's this particular theme that I wanted to address, the question of staying on our toes. So in his not so charitable description of human nature, one of the many characteristics that he ascribes to human beings is laziness. And there's a nice line in chapter 6, before he uses his quasi-mythical examples, where he says that men almost always walk on paths beaten by others and proceed in their actions by imitation. And the point that he's trying to make there is, because this is how we do things, he's going to give us the best examples, because using an image from Aristotle, he believes that if you aim higher, you will fail better. Right, so you're going to fail no matter what, so you might as well aim higher in order to fail better. And so he proposes the examples that Mario alluded to, so Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and the like. And the idea is that if you aim be Moses, you might actually be someone. Now, the problem with this trait, this human trait, this tendency towards laziness, is that he seems to think that we're constantly looking for ways to economize. So what we're looking for in a mirror of princes is a set of instructions that you can basically carry with you, and as you encounter different challenges during your rule, you can you can pull it out and look at what the recommendation is, apply the example, and everything will be fine. This, of course, doesn't work, and he lays out the reasons why that doesn't work in chapter 25, where he essentially makes a very eloquent case for how it's not only necessary to correctly understand what the example or theory that you might be trying to apply is, but also to understand the circumstances that you're facing. Because if you try to apply the lesson even correctly understood to circumstances that are different than the ones in which it was initially applied, that's going to fail. And so he goes through a series of descriptions of cases where the one doesn't match the other, right? So two people doing the same thing in different circumstances, they both succeed, and so on. And so in variations on that theme to show that there's really this desire for economy. Yes?
This is kind of an arbitrary point, but why does he call it like a mirror for princes, not like kings or?
Why is it a mirror for princes?
So I didn't get the question.
I don't know. It's just like an arbitrary term. Like you call them like rulers and stuff. Why prince and not king? Or
No, the books were also called specular regum, so
Yeah.
could be alternative, could be.
And you could say that
Same
in
thing.
using the term prince, there's the play on the fact that you're not just addressing princes, but also the person who's in charge.
So it's not so rigid as nowadays that the prince is the son of the king or
Right.
nothing like that.
Right. So, given that you need to correctly interpret the past, correctly read the examples, correctly read the circumstances, and do the application of the lesson, this means that you've got a lot of mental work to do. And if your tendency is to want to economize and to be lazy, something is likely to fail. I'm going to seek repose, and if I do, I will be incapable of applying these lessons properly. So, given this desire for ease and comfort, and the desire for prepackaged solutions, so to speak, economical answers to problems, he cannot possibly think that simple maxims, the kinds of things that you see in the titles of the chapter of the Prince, which read like maxims, mottos, lessons, and so on, that they will work. It goes against this reading of the audience. And so the solution has to be, so to speak, structural, in the sense that he's got to build in some mechanism that is going to force the reader to do the work that the reader doesn't want to do. And here I'm on very well-trodden territory, because there have been a lot of very good demonstrations of how he does this with specific concepts. One of the most famous ones is his treatment of Agathocles, another person who nobody had ever heard of before, if you read the description of the Oxford Classical Dictionary, he's one of the biggest losers in antiquity. There was a damnatio memoriae after his death because he was so incapable at receiving, and yet Machiavelli devotes a page and a half out of a short book of not even 100 pages on to Agathocles. And there he engages in an exercise which, among others, Victoria Kahn has demonstrated is a really sophisticated way of revisiting the concept of virtue. And for those of you who don't know it, let me just sum it up by saying that he makes it seem as though the second sentence negates the previous sentence. And so you read something and you say, okay, I get your point, and then you read the next sentence and it seems like it says the opposite of what the previous sentence said. And if you at some point, even the laziest of readers will say, wait a second, what is going on here? Okay, so he says, things like, if you consider Agathocles virtue, blah, 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 yet one cannot call it virtue, wait, you just did. And so there's this back and forth, and what he's trying to do is to get you to eventually sort of wake up and realize that there's something fishy about this presentation. And there are many things happening, which I don't want to go through in detail, but let me just say that Among other things, what he's doing is the kinds of things that the previous speakers have alluded to. So subversion, let's say, in the sense that he's challenging conventional ethical terms in the way that Mario demonstrated the mirrors of princes normally use. He's challenging maybe Christian conceptions of virtue. One thing that's pretty striking is that a contemporary reader of Machiavelli, upon hearing the term virtue, would have agreed that this must refer to something positive, and yet that person would have been trained in Greek virtue and the various varieties of Greek virtue, so Platonic virtue, Aristotelian virtue, and so on, but also Roman virtue and also Christian virtue, and Roman virtue and Christian virtue don't go together very well. And so it points to a problem, which is that we may be having a conversation in the gardens of Florence about virtue, and we may be nodding because we're agreeing about various claims regarding virtue, and yet we may be talking about very different things, because one of us is thinking about the kind of virtue that St. Augustine recommends, and another one of us might be thinking of conquest and glory and so on and so forth. And so he gets the reader to do this kind of work in a way that would have been counterproductive if it were simply presented as a direct challenge to this conventional morality, right? So you'd want to resist a reading that tells you that there's something wrong with Christian virtue. You'd want to resist a reading that tells you that there's something wrong with Greek virtue or Roman virtue. And so he sort of drags you along and brings you to this realization because you're the one who's doing the work. And yet you're doing the work despite the fact that you're lazy. And I'm not referring to anyone in particular because it's true of all of us, right? So he is doing there, I think, what he describes in chapter 14 as engaging in the mindset of war. So in chapter 14, he begins with a striking sentence in which he says essentially 4 times in the same sentence that this is the only thing a prince should study. Okay, now, with my rudimentary Renaissance history, I know that this must refer to the fact that princes actually lead their armies and maybe do some fighting and so on. But it turns out that it's a much broader description of the mindset of war, because what is the mindset of war? The mindset of war is the mindset that any ruler needs, even under the best of circumstances, because there's always crises and there's always insufficient resources, and you always have to turn on a dime. Doesn't matter how much time you spend developing your strategy. If your strategy turns out not to be useful in the moment that you're facing, you must abandon it very quickly and turn to something new. And so this is, again, the kind of mindset that requires a lot of work, and the type of thing that, to refer to a passage that we both like from Aristotle's Politics, the mindset that Aristotle recommends when he says that those who are charged with defending the Constitution, their job is to keep dangers far away, but sometimes it's to bring the dangers near so as to keep the citizens on their toes as guards on the walls, right, of the city, to preserve the city. And so it's an Aristotelian position in a strange way, because what it says is you've got to institutionalize this aspect of the return to the beginnings of cities, right? It's a reminder of what matters here, and I need to get you motivated even though you don't feel like being motivated. So I'm going to make a broad claim in the interest of time, which is that this type of move happens throughout the prince and throughout the discourses. And I'm happy to cheat here because the previous speakers have demonstrated different ways in which he does that, right? So the way he does it in Belfagor and his Modernity, for example, and I'll have something to say about the Modernity, but also this subversion of the genre from within, right? So you think you know what you're getting, but it turns out you're getting something different. Let me just give one more example. Traditionally, typically for a political treatise, the prince begins with a discussion of types of regimes. So in that sense, you might think that it's a typically scholastic or Aristotelian exercise in the sense that we're following this principle laid out first in Plato's Republic in Book 8 and then in Aristotle's Politics, which is that the type of constitution matters. 3 chapters into this exercise, you realize that the type of constitution doesn't matter, and that the ways in which it matters it may matter, are very different than the ones that Aristotle or Plato had recommended. Because, for example, he chooses to focus on the way in which cities were acquired. Strange. And then what he does with that is very interesting, because he tells you that there are hereditary and new principalities, but he spends most of his time on mixed principalities. And then eventually, as you think about what is it like to inherit a state, you realize that even under the best and most peaceful of circumstances, inheriting a state, you have to retake it. And so there's no really hereditary principality, that there's an element of seizing the state, whether you're actually adding a colony or simply replacing your uncle who just passed away. And so he uses these tropes, let's say, or these frameworks that are familiar to the reader, that make the reader feel comfortable. But once you're in that familiar setting, you get a kick in the butt that says, get up and do some thinking. So let me now move very quickly on to some other examples of how he is implementing this mindset in The Prince. There's first of all the example of the provocative epistle dedicatory, in which he recommends that the perspective of both the prince and the subject matter. And here I was hearing echoes of what Jim was talking about earlier, in the sense that he's doing something which is in some ways very old as Plato's Republic, but he's also doing it in a different way and in a new way. And what I mean by that is that whereas for pretty much anyone before him, the people would have constituted an indifferent blob, an agglomeration of different individuals. What he's trying to do is to show that there's value in treating them as individual brains. To put it very briefly, you would rather have people go along with what you want done than have to force them. Why? Because it's safer, it's cheaper, it's easier. And so this is a different perspective in the sense that whereas the prince looking down would have seen a mass of individuals, but focusing on the mass, he's focusing on the individuals and saying that there's a way for you to take that A, seriously, which is a new thing, and B, put it to good use in practical terms. But that again requires that you abandon this comfortable position, which is that as the prince, you have a certain expectation about your relationship to your subjects. Another example of this is the extension of this exercise of Agathocles to other terms. So as people who have read The Prince know, he devotes a series of chapters to the reconsideration of very familiar terms, right? So generosity and stinginess, everybody knows what those mean, and yet he turns them around slightly and shows you that there's another way to think about them, thereby introducing new possibilities, the kinds of things that Mario referred to as prudence. And then his controversial suggestions regarding different policies which would have been seen as matters already resolved. So for example, only a crazy person would recommend that you don't need to have a fortress. And yet he does. And yet he tells you that there are many disadvantages to having a fortress, and that perhaps you should think about something else, which is the subjects and how the subjects are going to feel as a result of you living in your fortress. So that's one aspect of it. Another is cavalry. It's a no-brainer that cavalry is preferable to infantry, and yet he points out that if your riders are useless, then you have a problem. So again, it's the people, it's the individuals. And of course, probably the most provocative of all, which is arm your subjects. And you know, any mirror of princes would have thought that arming your subjects is a very, very bad idea, very dangerous. But of course, he uses an interesting phrase, which is you have to make them your own. And by making them your own, I think he doesn't simply refer to the fact that they have some allegiance to you because of historical circumstances or the fact that they were born in Florence or whatever the state may be, but that you've won them over. And this, of course, requires that you are thinking about their perspective and you're trying to think about how it is that you can win them over, which means that you're treating them as minds rather than as little elements that are lost in the sea of the people. And so these things, I think, are added to other encouragements, let's say, to put it nicely. So, for example, his use of this Aristotelian image that I referred to earlier of the archer, it's essentially a motivational strategy. You see this at work in chapter 25, when essentially he begins by admitting that we have very little agency and basically things are outside of our control, and yet he says, so that free will be saved. St. Augustine is spinning in his grave. So that free will be saved, I've decided that half or a little less than half is up to us. But of course that's Machiavelli being the archer, because it's nowhere near half. But if he tells you that it's 49%, you might actually do a little bit better than if he told you it's hopeless, right? So it's an introduction of agency or an urging to agency. But other things as well, like the notorious example of Ramiro Daurco and the way in which you manipulate you let other people do the dirty work, which a couple of my colleagues have referred to as well. And so, the knowledge of knowing when to be good and when not to be good, and to use it and not use it according to necessity, so that the sort of the pair to the passage that Mario read earlier from chapter 18, but in chapter 15. And so essentially, again, no simple approach to the question of morality, no simple approach to the question of prudence, but an ability to read the circumstances and adapt to the demands of the circumstances. If the circumstances demand morality, you can do that. If the circumstances demand deviation from individual morality, you can do that as well, and that will be fine. Because, in one of those rare cases where common wisdom summaries of thinkers which are usually terrible, in this case it actually works pretty well, the ends justify the means. And so you have to consider what it is that you're trying to achieve, and as Mario said earlier, Churchill justifies a lot of his policies by pointing to the salvation of the state. The biggest reason, I think, for studying this topic is that this, as I said, is this first, to my mind, and I'm curious to hear people's views on this, the first real articulation of this idea that you need to take the mind seriously. Not the mind as some sort of appendage to the soul, not the mind as related to some conception of the person that is maybe metaphysical or maybe theological. Not the mind in the image of God, but the mind. The mind in a way that many people could understand. And Professor Zuckert, in her description of her reading of the story, I think said something relevant to this, which is that it's the human mind in this particular case that actually has won over on the devil, right? So there's something important going on in that mind, and by drawing attention to this fact, he is setting himself a challenge, because anybody who engages in psychology in the cheating way in which I've been using the term, if they believe what they're telling you, they must put it to use in their addressing an audience, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but if he believes that the human mind works a certain way and he's appealing to the human mind, he cannot ignore his findings. He needs to use them in what he's doing. And what I'm suggesting is that the weaving that one sees and the many contradictions that one sees, or apparent contradictions that one sees, are actually elements of that technique. And of course, the most striking element of that technique is the juxtaposition of the prince and the discourses, the so-called Machiavelli problem, right? Is he a Republican thinker, or is he a monarchist? And how can it be that these two books, which were written in close proximity to one another, both contain everything that he knows about politics, even though they talk about different things? That must mean that the regime doesn't matter, but that the fundamental truths of politics are somehow below the level of the regime. And of course, one of those levels is the human mind as part of an account of human nature. Thank you.
thank you so much to our panelists. It was really, I think, an extraordinary afternoon. And Professor Evrigenis did us a great, good service by summarizing and drawing connections among the three presentations. And so I am more than happy to open it up now to students and visitors. Okay, I have a question. I'm the captain now. Exactly. So Professor Evrigenis at the end of his talk talked about chapter 25 of The Prince, where Machiavelli enjoins human beings to go out and conquer fortune. And that's been a theme today. And so I think one theme I really want to pick up on is the issue of human agency that he's encouraging. And Machiavelli is anything but humble, because in that chapter 25, he says, and it's a rare instance of Machiavelli using the term, the technical Latin term for free will, but he says free will. And so in his very humble fashion, he says, so that our free will not be eliminated, I will judge. So it's my judgment that will bestow, that's how it's framed, free will. But there have been some other issues that have been going on, which is sort of his concern with subversion and sort of sotto supra, turning upside down a genre. And so I'm wondering if he's thinking about in the future his own genre and how he might have to turn that upside down to give future readers some type of agency. And in Professor Zuckert's paper, she said that the Jean Matteo got into trouble because he was going around bragging that a devil had taught him some things. And then the devil abandons him and he has to be out on his own. So one thing I'm wondering is that it's probably anachronistic to say that Machiavelli knew that he was going to be called a devil, but he certainly was after the fact. The Jesuits called him a devil. His name in England was Old Nick for the devil. So whether he's like, yeah, maybe you can use me, but don't use me too much. And really ultimately what we need to think about is how to be prudent and accommodate ourselves to circumstances that cannot be learned by route. So that's, would you like to comment on this?
My version of this would have been, I think Machiavelli willingly took a bad reputation in order to have the effect that he wanted. And one part of his teaching, at least as I understand it, is if he takes all the credit, which he says an advisor at the end, towards the end of the discourses, will never get, then he won't get anyone to follow his advice or recommendations. So he has to leave them the agency and the credit. I guess I have the mic. Now, there were people who had their hands up.
So just one quick thought, which is that if we're right about the subversion, to create a school that people follow is the exact opposite of what you should be doing, right? So if laziness is a problem, whether you're a follower of Jesus or a follower of Plato or whatever, there's a systemic problem there which has to do with the lack of willingness to think for yourself, and you need to be handed sort of a cheat sheet. And so I agree. I think that he's aware of the danger of creating Machiavellianism as something that is simply to be followed.
Right. Terrific. Thank you. Jahan, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I can project.
Yeah, he was debater. He was president of the debate club.
So thanks so much to the panel. One question I had that was really bothering me as I frantically flipped through the pages on the plane ride over here is the sort of tension between memory and all the immutable characteristics of human nature that y'all all touch on. So, you know, he talks about how in hereditary republics you can add on to it like a dentation, how, hereditary principalities, how republics are more difficult to conquer because there's more hatred, and memory of ancient liberty. And Discourses 116, man in nature is ferocious, brute, liberty-loving, but can be tamed by some kind of subjugation or education in subjugation. And, you know, I'm wondering how y'all all reconcile the issue of, well, there's certain things we remember well, but he also says that men in all times are wicked and they're not good.
Say a little bit more about the last part.
So I think everyone talked about how there's certain immutable traits to people. He says that, you know, people in all times are wicked. But I feel that, like, at least I was bothered when I was looking through it again by how many times there's certain things that people learn, whether through memory and, like, defending a baron in Prince 3 and, you know, having some kind of ancient love for someone. And I was bothered by how that relates to the idea that people are the same in every era.
Okay.
Thank you, Jahan.
Thank you. So, if people are the same, right? Even if it's true, it cuts against the notion that you should be thinking for yourself. So it's one of those things that an easy, simple description of human nature puts you at ease because you now know how things work, right? So if your choice is people are good or people are bad, what's the one that keeps you on your toes?
The wicked.
Right.
So it's a form of his education.
I see.
So I have a point about free will, and then one brief question for Jim and Catherine. So about free will, I would say that this is an interesting case for your or investigations about Machiavelli's psychology, because there is not only the question of laziness there. He says, let's assume that 50% is kind of a transcendental argument. If you want to justify the fact that we, aim to obtain results, we, fight for our goals or whatever, we have to have free will. My idea that this is based on his interpretation of Lucretius' indeterminism and so on, but that's another issue. The main issue here is, well, this 50%, however, is not the last word. The last word is that in the 50% of the cases, some people could act successfully, but not everybody, depending on the situation. So in this, 50% of the cases, nobody can do anything, but forget them. So the other 50%, in some cases, you have to be impetuous. In some others, you have to be cautious. So you have to be Julius II, or you have to be Fabius Maximus, the Concator, right? And wait. If you are not that, you don't have that temper, you don't have any hope of success. So even in the 50% that works, depends on your psychology if you have any chance. So this is an extra point about psychology. And about Jim, I wonder if, so but from my moderate study of the Renaissance, I always thought, until recently, after talking with Gabriele and reading your work, that the real Francesco Patrizi was the other one. But now I heard that this is the good one. And it's astonishing how modern he is. But my question is, could it be that the fact that he was from Siena is relevant here? I mean, Machiavelli wanted the factual truth, right? Did he see hope that, you can redistribute wealth there, that the Medici or the other families, gave up their wealth? I don't think he